Thank you for coming back from coffee and pastries to join us this morning. It's a real pleasure to be on Georgetown's main campus. Thank you, Dr. Urban and Dr. Fever, for convening this conference. I'm Phil Carter. I teach at the law school and have been working with a number of you in this field as a scholar and practitioner for some time, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and especially to follow Senator Jack Reed. It's probably appropriate that we talk about civil-military relations in the context of his talks, because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and I guess I'd be remiss as a lawyer and law professor for not starting with the Constitution, gives such an important role to the Congress in defining civil-military relations, and in particular, defining the relationship between the active forces, the reserve forces, and society that they serve. And so today's panel, this morning's panel, we're going to talk about politicization and the National Guard, as well as the increasing use of the National Guard for a variety of missions, including disaster response and law enforcement support and other things which have become quite controversial over the last few years. The Guard has a long history of these roles, and in many ways, the Guard's history in these roles is longer than that of the active force. We've gotten used to a standing military establishment since 1947, but it hasn't always been the case. And the military policy of the United States has largely relied on a small standing military and a larger militia to protect the country for more of its history. But of course, all that has changed in the last 75 years, and particularly in the last 50 years with the advent of the total force concept, which some of my former RAND colleagues have done a lot of research on and looked at. And what they've, I think, convincingly argued is it was never designed by Creighton Abrams to be the sort of apocryphal tripwire to war. There was never this sort of conscious design of the total force as being something that would bring the nation to war and force sort of hard decisions of democracy. But in practice, it has served that role, and it has played an important role as part of our national conversation about war and peace. It also played a very important role domestically as we think about how the nation responds to different crises, from New Orleans to Los Angeles to Portland and Washington, D.C. most recently. The National Guard has been on the forefront of crisis response and literal civil relations in a very, very consequential way. So I'm delighted this morning to explore these topics with such a brilliant panel, an experienced and thoughtful panel. To my right and your left, I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Blankshain of the U.S. Navy War College, Naval War College. And Jessica writes frequently for a number of publications, including places where I read her, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Just Security, and she's the co-author of Decision Making in American Foreign Policy. To her right and your left is Dr. Lindsay Cohn, eminent scholar in civil military relations, also a professor at the Naval War College, who is writing now 2 books on civil military relations, one focusing on domestic use of the military in law enforcement. So very topical. And to her right and your left is Major General retired, I want to make sure I get that correct after yesterday's discussion, William Walker, who has an incredibly important and thoughtful career in national service, both as a senior law enforcement official with the DEA for many years and as the commanding general of the DC National Guard until recently, and also recently the Sergeant at Arms of the House of Representatives. So, an important role in multiple branches of government over his career. And, what I'd love to do, and maybe I'll start with you, General Walker, is ask sort of, how did we get to this point? We seem to be at a unique point in history with respect to thinking about the Guard domestically, thinking about the Guard in the body politic. How do you tell the story of how we got here?
So, good morning, everyone. How I normally tell the story, the National Guard is older than the nation. December of 1636 is when the National Guard was created, the militia. Didn't become more formal until right before the World War I, 1903. 1903, thank you, 1903. And then the reserves was 1908. But the National Guard has really led the war efforts for the United States up until very recently. As you said, Mr. Carter, the Constitution calls for a small standing army that is backed up by the National Guard or the militia, and then, of course, the Army Reserves. But I also look at it, the United States has one army, and that is the United States Army. And that army comes in three forms. There's the active duty Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserves. There's one standard. We're all about readiness, all three components. Are we fit to fight, and are we ready to go tonight? So I just wanted to make that clear as well, that the FMs, the field manuals, the ARs, the Army regulations, the training circulars, the training manuals, they are enforced across the United States Army. And the same thing for the Air Force. As the commanding general of the District of Columbia National Guard, I was also responsible for the 113th Wing, and I can share with you there is one Air Force, one standard. We're a long way away from what Senator Reid talked about. The National Guard that he knew of is entirely different than the National Guard today. I can share with you when I was in Afghanistan, and there are Afghanistan veterans that I served with in the audience, the only way you could tell that a soldier or an airman was a guardsman was by the shoulder patch that they wore. So the National Guard today is more famous for supporting civil authorities. So you look at some of the civil unrest in Baltimore, Maryland, with Freddie Gray, the death of Freddie Gray, the death of Michael Brown in Missouri, and of course the death of George Floyd. So this civil unrest, the National Guard responds, and they respond in a state status. As most of you all know, posse comitatus prevents the active duty military from supporting civil law enforcement. But the National Guard, it doesn't apply to the National Guard. Now, the District of Columbia National Guard, which is never in a state status because it is not a state, we're always in a federal status. But the Department of Justice has ruled that posse comitatus, just like it doesn't apply to the active duty military, it doesn't apply to the National Guard writ large, including the District of Columbia National Guard. So we're able to be that 911 for civil law enforcement when they are overwhelmed and just can't do it without National Guard support. But it's scalable, it's tailorable, and if you tuned in and watched how the National Guard performed in the District of Columbia, it was proportional. So we had helmets, we had shields, because people threw, all kind of devices, bottled water that had been frozen, bricks, concrete slabs that they were throwing over the soldiers. So we had helmets, we had eye protection because people had lasers. But the moment the crowds became more peaceful, we adjusted as well. We went to patrol caps. We had our helmets on our sides. So we were able to respond in a measured, controlled way. I think another thing that gives the National Guard an advantage, many guardsmen are also police officers, they're firefighters, they're first responders. A lot of them are paramedics. So we were able to come to the aid of civilian law enforcement when they are clearly overwhelmed. So I just wanted to get that out. And then the last thing I wanted to say, that there are 54 National Guards in the United States. 53 are run by governors in their day-to-day operations. They're run by governors, and there are 53 adjutant generals. The District of Columbia is not a state, and the District of Columbia National Guard reports directly to the president through the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army. And that came about under President Nixon. And after January 6th, so when I was the commanding general, I worked for the Secretary of the Army, and I ran all matters by him, to include the District of Columbia Air National Guard. After I left, the day-to-day operation of the commanding general now is direct report to the Secretary of Defense. It just, a layer was removed. But Thomas Jefferson created the District of Columbia National Guard in 1802, right after West Point and the Naval Academy. 1802 was a consequential year when you think about those three organizations. So it was, the Guard, just like the entire military, is a learning organization. We do after-action reviews. We try to identify lessons, and when they're learned, when we make adjustments. So I think it's a good thing that there's, especially in an emergency, that commanding general, the only commanding general in the Guard, can go directly to the Secretary of Defense and be more responsive to whatever the Guard might be asked to do. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Blankshain, how do we get here?
Thank you very much, Phil. And I will just say, Lindsay and I are here in our personal capacity. We are proud Rhode Islanders, so thank you, Senator Reid. But we are here in our personal capacity, and anything we say does not represent the views of the U.S. Naval War College or any other federal entity.
But probably should.
No comment. So thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I did want to speak a little bit to this. So first of all, I'm going to step back a little bit from the specific focus on the National Guard to talk for a few minutes about the reserve component more broadly and the shift that Phil alluded to from a strategic reserve to an operational reserve and some of the implications that I think that's had, some of them very good from a standpoint of professionalism and effectiveness, things that Senator Reid talked about, but also some ways that this has created new tensions for civil-military relations. So, as Phil mentioned, a long history of sort of big mobilizations and demobilizations up through World War II, where there would be a big mobilization, including a draft, including reserve mobilization, demobilization. This is somewhat formalized in the late 40s, early 50s with the selective reserve system. But then in Vietnam, President Johnson decides that while there is a draft, he's reluctant to fully mobilize and deploy the reserve component because this could potentially signal externally a bigger conflict, which was not what he wanted to do, but also it might have political costs internally. And then we get this result of the reserve component being seen as sort of the place to be if you don't want to go to Vietnam. So we then get the total force policy, which, yes, the history now seems to have settled on the idea that this was primarily driven by budgetary concerns and the goal of maintaining and maintaining capacity on a smaller budget. So a lot of things were moved into the Guard and into the reserve. But there were some who thought it might have this added bonus, potentially some in Congress, particularly have this added bonus of avoiding another Vietnam by integrating the military into society in a particular way, that if there were another conflict, reserves would have to be called up. This would be very disruptive to communities. People would care. So we get the first test of this in Desert Storm. Reserves are mobilized and deployed. There are actually, Congress pays attention, cares, but it happens and it's widely seen as a success. And this is sort of the beginning of what we see over the next few decades of increasing use of the reserve component as part of pretty regular ongoing operations. Historian Miranda Summers-Lowe has written some great things about this if you want to look it up and get more of the stats. We often think of this as a shift that happened after 9/11, with the reserve component being used very heavily in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is true, but it didn't start then. It started earlier in the 90s with a lot of the peacekeeping missions that were going on, other overseas operations, both the need to compensate for the fact that the regular army had been downsized after the Cold War, but also the fact that through the total force policy, decisions had been made to move particular specialties largely into the reserve component, and some of these were things like civil affairs that were really useful in some of these 90s era missions. So Miranda Summers-Lowe in particular argues that by the time we got to 9/11, using the reserve component in this way was really seen as normal and was not sort of a big deal mobilization in the way that it had been previously. So I have a lot of stats for people who are interested, but I'll just keep it brief for now. One of the ones that really struck me was that by the mid-2000s, reservists averaged more than 70 days per year on active duty, excluding training. So this is in support of exercises and operations, which was up from 14 days a year in the mid-90s and 1 day a year before Desert Storm. So we do see a significant change in the role of members of the reserves, members of the guards, and the way that they are used, particularly in overseas deployments. I think we're going to talk some about the changes in the way they've been used domestically too. And large numbers of troops who were overseas over the last decades were members of the reserve component. And if you see, there have been interviews, there's an NPR one I'm thinking of, with members of the reserve component and saying that they saw this shift in attitude of people joining that sort of even in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was more of this, this is just sort of a part-time thing that I can get money for college type of thing, where by the mid-2000s, or sorry, by 2005, 2006, when there's a lot going on in Iraq, it really was seen as, if I'm in the reserve component, I'm going. Particularly in the Army, obviously, there are service differences. So that's where we are now, and I think this does have implications for how we think about the role of the reserve component. And if you think about sort of the, I don't want to say mythology, but sort of the branding and imagery around the reserve component and the National Guard in particular is very focused on this idea of the Minuteman, right? The regular citizen who in times of need takes up arms to defend the country. And that branding is a bit at odds with this new idea of very professional reservists and members of the Guard who are part of one army and really much more closely identified with the military profession than they might have been many decades ago, which has implications for things like the question we received yesterday, which I'm happy to go into more later, about members of the reserve component serving in Congress. That might look very different now when members of the reserves are playing a very different role and might be seen by society as much closer to the regular active duty military than they previously were. Might also have implications for things like domestic use of the National Guard. There might be more confusion today about, well, you know, these are the same people that I just saw on the news over in Afghanistan or Iraq, and now they're operating in American cities. It might look different. So happy to talk about all of that more as we get into discussion, but for now I will leave it there.
Thank you. Dr. Cohn?
So as Phil mentioned, I'm working on a big project looking at the history of how federal forces have been used domestically for policing purposes. And so I do think it's important to clarify that it's not actually illegal to use the active duty forces for domestic policing purposes, and that is embedded both in the Constitution and in very, very early statute. What has changed over time is, number one, the sort of expansion of other types of law enforcement agencies so that there are alternatives to using the military for these purposes. The professionalization of the National Guard, which makes the National Guard another alternative. A couple of issues relating to Vietnam, and then also the sort of both public and DoD concept of the appropriateness of this kind of use. So for the first 150 years or so, nobody really saw an issue with this, but that is different now. And I think that matters for a whole bunch of reasons related to policing that we can get into. But so the role of the National Guard, and I will focus more on the National Guard because as General Walker pointed out, the federal reserves have existed only since 1908. We did not have federal reserves before then. So the question of using reserves in a domestic policing role did not come up and still doesn't. Usually we don't mobilize the reserves to do that kind of thing. But the way that the system was set up in the United States was that law enforcement was supposed to happen at the lowest possible level. And if it couldn't be handled at that level, then you would escalate. And so originally the idea was, and we didn't have police, right? There were no police institutions in the United States at the founding. We had sheriffs, we had neighborhood watch, we had private security. Private security is actually a very old concept, but we did not have public servants who were police in an institutionalized and professionalized way. And so the idea was you had a sheriff who could deputize people to help him, it was always him, deal with unrest, law enforcement issues. But if they were large unrest issues, frequently a sheriff was not enough. And so then the next line was supposed to be the mayor or whoever the local civil authority was supposed to call the governor. Well, you couldn't call them, telegraph the governor, or send a rider or something like that, and say, could you mobilize the militia? What is now the National Guard, right? Could you mobilize the militia? Well, sometimes they could and sometimes they couldn't. Many states and territories didn't actually maintain an organized militia. The organized militia was just a group, people who had volunteered to be on a list to be mobilized in case of need. And they were often widely scattered, had no training or very little training, provided their own weapons, of course, etc. And so sometimes the governor would mobilize them. Sometimes the governor decided, I don't have the capacity to mobilize them, or I don't have any, or, and this was very frequent, I don't want to pay for it. So the governor would sometimes mobilize the militia. Sometimes the militia were already involved, right? Sometimes the militia were the unrest. So this is, a little complicated. So frequently the governor would then contact either the local army representative, right? There were army forts in various places, or the Secretary of War, or the president, whoever the governor happened to have personal connections with. And that official would then decide whether to send the army to help or not. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. Over time this changed, right? But in general, if by the time the president was asked to intervene, by the time federal forces were asked to intervene, the militia was already involved one way or another. So we did not used to federalize the militia to do law enforcement. We would federalize them to do overseas stuff, or to fight wars like the Civil War or the Mexican-American War. Then we would call them into federal service and they would show up in federal service. But we didn't do it for law enforcement. And then fast forward to 1903 and the Dick Act, which formalized the National Guard as the National Guard and formalized them as a Federal Reserve component. Right? It said, you guys now count not just as belonging to the governor and not just as a group that the president can call into service according to the Constitution and statute, but you're actually just permanently designated as a Federal Reserve, which is why they have the same standards as the Army, right? Why they have the same training standards, etc. But that law also specifically said, you can be called into federal service for domestic purposes when the forces already at the president's command are not sufficient. In other words, the Dick Act formalized the existing practice of using the active component first and calling up the National Guard for such purposes only when necessary. The federal government didn't really do much intervention so the summer of 1919 and the few years up until about 1921, there was a lot of domestic unrest, a lot of intervention. But after that, between the two world wars, there really wasn't much. Then after World War II, you get into the 1950s, right? And you get into the issues of segregation, and then in the 60s, civil rights, and then in the late 60s and 70s, Vietnam protests. And what you started having here was the federal government needing to do things that the governors actively opposed, and were in some cases trying to use their National Guard to resist. So the example of Little Rock in 1954 is the famous one. There was also the so-called Battle of Oxford in Oxford, Mississippi, 1962, when James Meredith a black veteran, tried to enroll in the University of in Ole Miss. And not only the governor, but the state police tried to stop him. There were federal marshals. It was originally federal marshals were sent to protect him and get him enrolled. They were attacked by a mob, and I mean like a huge mob of students state police, etc. And the governor refused to activate the National Guard to help. So in many of these situations, and that's just an example, in many of these situations, the president federalized the state National Guard in order to get them out from under the control of the governor, in order to prevent the governor from using them. And I have to say, in all cases, the National Guard acted with extreme professionalism and did not resist federalization or federal orders. Although, as General Walker can tell you, some of them were then fired by the governor when they went home after the federal orders. In the 1960s and 70s, though, and I'm sorry I'm rambling on about this, but I think it's useful context, then you have Vietnam. And as Dr. Blankshain pointed out, the National Guard and the reserves were not mobilized to go to Vietnam. So at home, you have a bunch of protests going on, and who is there and available to deal with them? The National Guard. That's when they start being the main go-to force for dealing with domestic unrest. And that point is where you start having a few incidents like Kent State, where you have issues with weapons discipline, issues with lack of training, lack of professionalism, because again, the National Guard at that time was frequently sort of a refuge for people who did not want to be involved in this kind of thing, right? But that is the start of when there was a massive shift in both public opinion in terms of like who is the appropriate agency to do this domestic policing mission. And let's be honest, the Army, neither the Army nor the National Guard has ever liked this mission. Nobody likes this mission, right? Nobody wants to do this. But the Army had generally accepted it as normal, and the National Guard has generally accepted it as normal. It's around the 1970s that changes, and that both. So the National Guard accepts that this is one of their main duties, and they train for it, et cetera. The regular Army, at this point, made a pretty large shift, both culturally and doctrinally, right? They wrote into doctrine that they don't do this anymore. And that's where we are today. We are today at the point where the public, the Army, pretty much everyone believes that this is not a mission that's appropriate for the active duty to do. And it is appropriate for the National Guard. And Jess and I have some research on public opinion that we can get into if you're interested. But I think it's important to recognize that this is a fairly recent shift, and it happened in the context of the same context that we have heard talked about over the last day or two of real shift in quality and professionalism and training of the military, the one Army, the one Air Force, that started after Vietnam, started in the 1980s and has continued to this day. So I'll stop there, but I thought that was maybe useful
I'll just
context.
comment that although the Army may not want to have this mission, they still provide the left and right limits of how that support is executed. FM 3-19, Field Manual 3-19 by the United States Army, Joint Publication 3-28, establishes how the military, specifically the National Guard, is going to support civil authorities. Yes. So you're right. It's not a mission that the Pentagon or the Army wants us to have, but you still have to have it in an ordered, disciplined fashion when you come out to support civil authorities. So it's very precise how we support civil authorities, Joint Pub, and then Army Field Manuals. I needed to add that.
It's a great segue. Sure, go ahead.
Real quick. So yes, this is an excellent point, and I mentioned the doctrinal development. One of the doctrinal developments is increased clarity in the rules of the use of force in a domestic context, because keep in mind that in a domestic context, members of the military are not operating under the rules of war. They're operating under domestic law. Right, and so they have to have clarified rules, and it's just an interesting point that back in the 19th century, the rules for the use of force in domestic situations included live ammunition, bayonets, cannons, buckshot, all kinds of fun things. So we've narrowed the parameters of what's allowed to be used.
As I listened to the three of you talk, and particularly your comments just now, Lindsay, I'm reminded of that famous Faulkner line that, the past is not history, it's not even past. And General Walker, as you described Posse Comitatus, I thought, The history of that statute comes out of Reconstruction. It was a statute intended to prevent the federal forces from being involved in state and local law enforcement.
1878.
Right. So we're still living with that legacy, and we're still living with the legacy of wanting to make sure that law enforcement is conducted by politically accountable local forces or elements that are responding most to the people of the communities that they serve, for better or worse. Sometimes that meant local control of mayors, councils, governors, et cetera, that were not seeking to uphold the law, and sometimes it meant the opposite. But I think, Lindsay, you make this elegant point of who is the right agency to do this mission, right? Bad things will happen in the U.S., whether it's disasters, civil unrest, large-scale issues like COVID. What's the best tool in the shed? It feels like we keep going back to the Guard because it's there. And we keep going back to the Guard because it has this unique state status. But if you were able to whiteboard a solution for the country, would it be the Guard? Should the Guard be as active in the domestic law enforcement missions as it has been for the last 30 or 50 years? What's the right answer?
So the National Guard is in 3,000 communities in the United States. 1992, I was in the Florida National Guard. Hurricane Andrew, I don't know if it's a young crowd, you might not remember it, but 1992.
I remember it.
The Broward County overwhelmed. So to answer your question, who should be responsible? City, county, state. If they're overwhelmed, if they're incapacitated, then it must be the National Guard. The thing that the governor was able to do, he mobilized the entire Florida National Guard. So they came from areas not affected by the hurricane. Some of them, the 20th Special Forces Group, jumped in to Miami. Others came up, you had to get there, and they were there quickly. I wasn't living in the United States at the time. I was a DEA special agent assigned overseas. But as soon as the airports were able to, I got there within 3 days, and I stayed there for months. And we restored law and order, and we actually set up food banks. We moved bodies through mortuary affairs units. So it's the National Guard, without question, when the city, the county, and the state government just can't do it for whatever reason.
I would add, so I kind of have two sets of feelings about this question. On the one hand, as I mentioned, there has been a proliferation of federal level law enforcement and disaster response agencies over the 20th century. And so there are civil agencies that can help with these kinds of things. I do think that the National Guard is very, very well placed to do these missions. However, I think that if we're going to ask them to do all these missions, including be an operational reserve and respond to domestic stuff, they need a lot more resources. If we're going to ask them to do all of this stuff, they need more stuff. And they need more people, right? We may get into recruiting. The National Guard is really hurting with recruiting. And so I think that's kind of my one set. My other set of feelings, as Jess pointed out, the fact that the National Guard and the reserves now look to the public so much more like the regular military raises the question, and this comes from sort of the comparative literature. Where's Ron Krebs? I'm doing comparative. There he is. The comparative literature looking at how the public, looking at the civil-military relations of using a military agency as your primary disaster response, domestic response agency, and whether that is, in fact, a good idea. And I don't think that General Walker is arguing that you should. I think he's saying if the other agencies are not sufficient, correct me if I'm... Right. If the other agencies are not sufficient, then we have the National Guard, and I think that's great. And I think they're really good at it, and they've demonstrated that many, many times. And they are so professionalized now. It's, you know... But I think we should absolutely, as a crowd of people who care about civil-military relations, we should absolutely be asking ourselves, should the public think, oh no, there's a problem, where's the military?
I think, so in the District of Columbia National Guard in 2015, when I was a one-star general, but I was in charge of the land forces in the District of Columbia National Guard. I ordered these vests that in the front and back, big bold letters, District of Columbia National Guard.
Excellent.
And in the front, the District of Columbia flag, which is George Washington's flag, you cannot miss it. That served me very well during the riots because the Washington Post, the New York Times, I got calls from them saying, hey, we can't find you all abusing anybody. And I said, well, you have my sympathies. Because, they were trying to sell papers. But the fact that, and there were a lot of people out there similarly attired, and they were federal law enforcement from a variety of agencies in the Department of Justice that the Attorney General brought out. But you could distinguish a guardsman, Army and Air, because I bought enough of these vests that clearly say District of Columbia National Guard or DC National Guard, depending on when we were able to buy them. And in the front, that big, giant red flag, and it helped tremendously. I just want to back up a little bit about what you talked about. I'm sure you're familiar with Colonel Summers' book on strategy, where after the Vietnam War, that the combat support and the combat service support would be pushed over to the reserves. So when the nation goes to war, it goes to war as a nation. Your milkmen, your firemen, everybody was going to war because the combat support and service support was in the reserve component. That's why the Guard is so effective when coming out to deal with civil unrest, civil disturbance, disasters. They're trained in that support that makes the Army run, that makes the Air Force run. So I just wanted to touch on that just for a second.
Do you want to jump in?
I wanted to pick up on one thing that I think is important, that there's one way to think about this of kind of what's the right level of response, federal, state, local, and we have our own research where we do this and we ask local law enforcement, state National Guard, federal active troops. But I think Lindsay's point about why the military or why the sort of armed component is a really important one and gets back to a lot of the conversations we had yesterday about sort of the gap in credibility and trust between military institutions and civilian institutions, and how you get into this vicious cycle of we ask the military, speaking broadly here, to do things because they're available and willing to do it. And I'm thinking particularly of the example that came up yesterday of having members of the National Guard driving school buses, right? Like, that is not a particular mission set for them. They're just people who are available and you can tell them to do it. And then that reinforces that capacity and trust in that institution to do things while the civilian agencies and capacity continue to atrophy and not get support. And it just turns into this vicious cycle that I think contributes to some of these kind of trust and credibility problems that we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, and I, speaking as a former guardsman, would certainly not feel competent to teach my daughter's elementary school class. I think that would be rougher than combat in many ways. I want to pick up on this comment, General Walker, that you made. I think offhand, but I think it's really significant about the paramilitarization of law enforcement. The number of my colleagues in the legal academy have made the argument that the increasing use of the Guard at home and the reserves at home, coupled with our wars of the last 20 years and other changes, have led to a really militarized approach to law enforcement in the U.S. Not by the Guard per se, not by the reserves, but by local law enforcement that are putting on camouflage and deploying highly armed SWAT teams with armored vehicles they've bought from the Defense Department through various processes. What do we think about that? Is that a natural response to a greater threat coming from criminal organizations? Is that sort of demand driven by citizens? Does it create normative problems or practical problems? I'm curious what this group thinks based on your expertise and experience.
So 33 years in law enforcement, I don't think you need a military approach to going out to have law and order. I think at least my position as a guardsman was that you dress for a riot, you'll get a riot. And if you, and that's why we quickly would go to patrol caps. We would instantly try to de-escalate and talk to people. But if you roll up dress for battle, I believe you're going to get a battle. And I think the problem, the challenge is this surplus military equipment that is, in some cases, the police departments are not buying it. It's being gifted to them. It's being granted to them. And they want to, see what the latest toys look like and feel like, and they put it on, and then they respond with a mindset that's different from, that policeman that's walking a beat on a corner that knows people. It's a completely different, that's what makes it frightening. Today's policemen are not the police of old, even the 70s and 80s. It's different police departments out there.
So one way I think about this is, from a civ-mil standpoint, is there are obviously a lot of other ways to approach this, but this is an issue for the military profession. That part of being a profession is being able to control the boundaries of who's in and who's out and enforce ethical and other regulations within the profession. And what we get here when you have local law enforcement, which is, Lindsay can speak much more to this, but very decentralized, very different, standards and accountability and ability to enforce things, using military equipment, dressing in effectively military uniforms, to the public, that can really blur the line of who's in and who's out of this club, right? And I think that can create real issues for the military profession that are not really being grappled with.
So I think a couple of things that General Walker said I think are really important. When we talk about militarization of the police or militarized policing, there are three totally different things that we can mean by that. One is equipment, right? Equipment, stuff, including uniforms. There is actually a fair amount of research out there that looks at how the public responds to different types of uniforms that police are wearing, whether they're all black to look sort of special operations-y, whether they're fatigues, whether they're the sort of blue civilian. So equipment, uniforms, et cetera, that's one meaning of militarized policing. A second meaning, and this one is generally seen in a positive sense, is professionalism and organizational structure. And most police forces in the world do, at least the ones that have professionalized, as opposed to being sort of amateur, sheriff style. And I'm not saying that sheriffs are still amateurs, but originally that was the sheriff model. That has actually been the norm, is to look at military professionalism as a goal to professionalize police departments, to make them more structured and systematic. And that is something that has happened, and I think most researchers consider it fairly positive. The third one, and this is picking up on a point that General Walker made, the third one is culture. Militarized policing can be considered a cultural choice to view violence and threat as the effective way to deal with things. And if you are in a society that views crime as something that needs to be deterred by the threat of terrible punishment, and not as something else to be dealt with in some other way, you're going to get a police culture that views its job as using violence and threat. And that's one of the things that we have got now. Again, as the general pointed out, not always been the case. But the U.S. military, the U.S. policing organizations have used the U.S. military as a model for quite some time for tactics, right? Going back to the way that the military behaved in the Philippines in 1900 to 1902. Several U.S. state police forces, which were originally, the first state police force that we had was Pennsylvania, 1905. They looked specifically at the tactics of the sort of counterinsurgency tactics that we used in the Philippines. Same thing with Vietnam. In terms of the weapons and equipment and stuff, absolutely, the war on drugs and the war on terror really produced this idea that we should give all of this equipment. We had this equipment, let's give it. Much of it coming from politicians, right? State politicians wanting to get stuff for their state, right? But it started in the 1960s with the Austin church tower shooting, where the police had to deal with an individual who was highly competent with very, very effective weaponry barricaded in a defensible position, and they had no way to deal with it. That's when SWAT teams were born. So there are a bunch of different things going on. What I would just say about, you asked about how the public feels about this. We actually know a fair amount about how the public feels about this and about its effectiveness. And we know that militarized policing in the two sort of negative senses that I mentioned do not seem to help with effectiveness. They don't lower crime. They don't make citizens feel safer. What they do is make police feel safer. Mm-hmm. Police tend to like these kinds of things because they feel safer, and in some cases with good reason, right? Again, the Austin Church Tower shooting was one of the main, the main impetus for this. But the public does not tend to feel safer. It doesn't lower crime. Order maintenance policing doesn't lower crime. And I think General Walker just hit the nail on the head when he said, if you show up dressed for a riot, you're going to get a riot.
Indeed. And I want to put in a plug for my Georgetown law colleague, Rosa Brooks' new book, Tangled in Blue. She's a law school professor, former Pentagon official, went through the DC Police Academy as a reserve officer, and writes really persuasively about the culture that she was taught and the sense that officer safety was the most important value, even above community safety. And that led to a number of behaviors that she observed as problematic. I want to take us in maybe a more controversial direction before we open it up to audience questions and talk about the increasingly politicized and polarized environment that we live in the context of the Guard. So the Guard, as you all talked about, has this interesting command structure where most Guard organizations, 53 of the 54, report to a governor who is elected. I think at least a couple of the adjutants general of those states are actually elected themselves. And those governors, take on a very political flavor. They range from California to Florida and everything in between. How does that politicization, sort of de jure and de facto politicization of the Guard's leadership, affect the Guard as an organization? How should the modern adjutant general respond to a highly politicized general, and particularly the scenario we've seen recently where state National Guard organizations were stuck between the Defense Department mandating COVID-19 vaccination and a governor that was saying, absolutely not, don't do it. What's a Guard general to do, General?
So the Guard, those 53, so when I was the commanding general of the District of Columbia National Guard, I was unencumbered by that. So the Pentagon says we're going to get the COVID shot. We lined up and we took it. So it was just that simple. There was no governor to say, no, you're not going to do it. But the 53 adjutant generals that work for a governor, if they want to stay generals, they need to do what that governor wants done, and then reconcile that with what the Army wants or what the Air Force wants. But when they're getting ready to go to war, then it's what the Air Force wants, what the Army wants done. But in its state status, that the governor is the commander-in-chief of that state force. And I experienced that in the New Jersey Guard and the Illinois Guard and the Florida Guard. As I bounced around as a DEA agent, I found a Guard or reserve unit to join.
So to follow up, does that mean we're going to start seeing, for better or worse, Red State Guard and Blue State Guard? And does that have potential interoperability problems or other stuff?
No, you'll never see that. I think an adjutant general would probably resign if a governor asked him or her to do something that you couldn't live with as a professional officer, as a general officer. I personally know, I can't name them, but I know adjutant generals who just said, I'm done, and resigned. So I have enough faith, trust, and confidence in the military profession, professional military officer, who takes that oath, which does not expire, to live up to that oath.
Which is unique because that resignation norm is not strong on the active duty side and actually is rarely seen among general officers. There's a silent questioning, there's a silent pushback, but the sort of quiet or noisy withdrawal that you describe is almost never exercised in the federal side.
I think it should be quiet. When you leave, if your views are, if you believe that you're being told to do something that's immoral, unethical, illegal, then you should quietly leave. You don't want to, it goes against the profession of arms to make a big deal about it. So sometimes when you see, hey, this general left or that admiral left, you might not know why. You might not know what he or she might have been tasked with and just found it incompatible with how they believe they should perform as a professional soldier or professional military person.
Go ahead. No, you
Flip.
All right, okay.
Flip a coin.
After you. Yeah, so I think of the example specifically of the Oklahoma adjutant general with the COVID vaccine situation, where the original adjutant general was actually removed by the governor because he would not. So the Department of Defense mandated the COVID vaccine, right? And interestingly, as we have heard, the governor is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard, but the personnel stuff is regulated by the DoD. And so, the governor can say, do this, do that, or don't do this, don't do that, but the governor can't say, I'm changing the personnel rules. And so the issue of the vaccine technically was a personnel issue. And so this put the adjutant general in an absolutely impossible position because the governor was telling him basically not to obey a directive from the DoD. And the first adjutant general wouldn't do it. He said, no, I'm going to have my people vaccinated. And the governor removed him, which the governor had the absolute authority and right to do, and put someone else in who would do what he wanted. And that adjutant general said, okay, we're just going to wait and see what happens with a number of lawsuits that were going on, right? But of course, there was a deadline by when people had to be vaccinated. And so this kind of tension, it's happened before. There are plenty of times in US history when there's been a federal state kind of thing, but someone has always backed down. We actually don't know what would happen if neither side had backed down. Now, I think the DoD handled it brilliantly and masterfully in that they didn't threaten to punish Oklahoma. They didn't threaten to defund the Oklahoma National Guard, right? They didn't threaten
they kind of did.
Punish. What's that?
They kind of did.
No, what they did was threaten individuals who refused to get that back, which is very different, right? Because threatening to defund the whole Oklahoma National Guard would have punished all kinds of people who had nothing to do with this.
But this has come to a head before in the case of Perpich versus Department of Defense.
Yes.
Supreme Court steps in and says...
But that was an operational issue.
Correct. So maybe elaborate what you think is where do you think this would play out where it hasn't come to a head before?
Well, and in Perpich, the decision was the governor can't stop this.
Right.
In Perpich, the decision was the federal government is supreme. But again, that is a situation where the governors the governors did not want their National Guard mobilized to go on an overseas exercise. They didn't think it was appropriate. And so they said, nope, not going to do it. And the government said, yes, you are. There was a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court said the federal government is supreme. But again, what you have here is governors who then backed down, right? Mm-hmm. What if they had simply said, too bad, I'm not mobilizing my people? We don't know what happens then. We haven't had that.
Yeah.
So, so I made Lindsay go first because I knew she was going to cover it all very well. I will just say that I think that this is symptomatic of much broader issues we're seeing in American politics with federalism as an issue. So it's not really surprising that it's playing out in terms of the National Guard, specifically given everything we've just talked about the kind of dual structure between the state and the federal capacity. But I wanted to take this question in just a slightly different angle on the politicization issue, because I think there are big structural things going on with the federalism level that is going to play into potential perceived politicization here. But I wanted to come back to one thing that came up yesterday that's more at the individual level. And we talk about this more often in the context of retired officers and their political activity, but as came up yesterday, we're talking about it more in the context of members of the Guard and the Reserve component who, when they are not on duty status, have much more freedom in their political activity. And this, given the combination of the operational reserve component, as we talked about, where members of the reserve component are potentially seen as much more similar to the professional active duty military than they might have been decades ago, and a hyper-partisan, polarized political environment, I think we're seeing where this can lead to some real tensions in terms of just, regular individuals' political activity, showing up at campaign rallies in uniform and things like that, which actually does usually seem to get disciplined, but also candidates running for office, individuals who are in office, who are also in a reserve or Guard status, and we've seen a real blurring of the lines there. There are a lot of benefits, as I think Senator Reid talked about earlier, of having that experience, right? Knowing what questions to ask, these types of things can be really beneficial. But when you have, just as one example, a member of Congress saying, I believe this was on Fox News, but it was a partisan media environment, saying, I was just deployed to the border in my National Guard capacity, and here's why my governor is very wrong for what he's doing about this deployment. That really blurs the line, right, of are you speaking as a member of Congress and criticizing another politician from the opposite political party, or are you speaking as a member of the National Guard about your commander-in-chief, which is very different. And I think when those lines get blurred, it just kind of reinforces this idea of politicization in the Guard, I think, in particular, but it can bleed over into the military more broadly.
Terrific. So we have time to bring you all into the discussion too. I'd love if anyone wants to ask a question to queue up at the microphones as we've done the last few panels. And sir, I think we'll start with you.
Good morning. Colonel James Ashworth. I'm a British officer embedded with the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. So thank you very much. You've certainly educated me on a subject that I wasn't too au fait with. My question is really picking up on a number of commentators who've talked about a smaller standing force that is surged in time of war, and linking to that to your description of one force, and yet to me at least, some clear delineations of both orientation and command within its components. And therefore, what do you as a panel feel the appropriate role is for the National Guard in both the deterrence of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and if that fails, in an actual conflict, where one would expect a significant increase in either domestic attack or disruption on continental US, asymmetric or otherwise? Thank you.
So, as you might imagine, I see the National Guard as a Swiss Army knife. I through 39 years, 8 months in the Guard, and I spent time on active duty in the Army Reserves, and in multiple different states. We fight and win the nation's wars, along with our active duty and reserve counterparts. And like I said earlier, there's one standard. We all take the physical fitness test, and you're either go or no go. We get on a scale, and you either meet 600-9, 670-1, or you don't. And there's no ambiguity about that. To this day, I still get on the scale every morning. So, oh man, I'm a pound or 2 pounds away from it. It's a way of life. So that's how I look at it. Whatever the nation asks the National Guard or any Guard I was in, we were able to execute the mission successfully, consistently. So that's how I see the National Guard.
So I think one thing to consider here is that this is one of the trade-offs that you make when you shift to an operational reserve, is that you no longer have a strategic reserve, or it looks very different, right? That where in the system with a strategic reserve, the idea is if they're there and ready if you need a big mobilization. If they're in play all the time and getting stretched in a lot of recent cases by the degree to which they're being used and deployed, then they're not available for that strategic surge because they're just part of ongoing operations, right? So then there are other considerations of what you would do if you needed a bigger mobilization, whether it's calling up other parts of the reserve, right, which is in different sort of tranches of mobilization. We talked a bit yesterday about the possibility of conscription, other ways of trying to increase recruiting, right? But it's just the levers are different once you've already moved to an operational reserve.
I also think you could draw on the inactive reserves. So at a certain age, when you leave the Army, you've done your 20 years or 25 years, and you're much younger than me, you can still be called to serve. So the Army has a list of soldiers, airmen, and believe me, they can be called.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. So I don't think it's as dark as you might imagine because of that reach. So you were in the inactive reserves and called up. I mean, it happens.
It does. And it was a great opportunity to serve. I think one thing I do take forward to answer your question, though, is you need a little bit more truth and readiness, too. So we have a bit of in my opinion, a hollow reserve. If you look at the track record of the last 20 years, and this isn't divulging anything sensitive, I think this has been published, any given reserve unit might have had 10 to 50% of its people be non-deployable or non-usable for some reason or another, and that persists. And so this idea that you could rely on them either for an operational reserve or a strategic reserve needs to be, I think, stress tested and really resourced adequately to create a reserve that actually can meet the requirement that's asked of it. And so if you want a reserve that can protect supply chains at home under threat from a peer competitor like China, or if you want a reserve that can deploy to Eastern Europe, you really need to resource it more aggressively and be honest with yourself about what its mobilization timelines are. The idea that you're going to get a functional reserve component, the active component readiness level within 90 days, I think is fantasy. And I think we need to be much more realistic about that. It's one thing when you're going to patrol the streets of Bakuba or someplace. It's quite another if you're going to engage in high-end conflict. And I think we're probably a little bit too optimistic about our capabilities right now.
You bring up a great point, but one of the solutions is TRICARE for reserves. So when you get mobilized, you go to a combat readiness center before you go to the war. And a lot of times you would see soldiers that could not go further because dental or some other medical challenge that they had, and they didn't have insurance that would cover it. But TRICARE for reserves is one of the things that will contribute materially to readiness of Guard and Reserve.
And in fact, this is an argument for national health care too.
Wait, can I?
Yeah,
answer?
go, and then we'll
Thank
go to
you.
Carrie.
Yeah, so I think this is an excellent question. I would say, number one, the role of the Guard is in statute, and it would be extremely difficult to change both legislatively and organizationally. And I don't think anyone is really advocating for that or wants it. So what I would say is two things. Number one, for domestic issues that are more of a law enforcement type, we have tons of other agencies that can deal with that. For the kind of thing that Phil is talking about, that I think a National Guard would be an excellent agency to take on the mission of guarding domestic infrastructure, I think they would be excellent at that. But what I think we would need, we can't grow the end strength of the active component. That's just not happening. What I do think we need to do is try to massively grow the end strength of the reserve component, because that would reduce the pressure on the operational reserve aspect. If we had a much larger reserve component, then we could have some of them be in a strategic reserve status and some of them be in an operational reserve. So I think that would be my sort of doable, feasible policy recommendation.
I agree.
Dr. Lee.
Good morning. So when we think back to, LBJ's reluctance to call up the Guard and Reserve, it was seen as being particularly destabilizing to communities, because these are folks who are the teachers and the doctors and the lawyers in one's community, and 18-year-olds are fresh out of high school and nobody's going to miss them, right? Crassly. I'm wondering, the narrative that I hear often is that with this transition to an operational reserve and with the kind of frequent deployments over the last 20 years, the kinds of jobs that people in the Guard and the Reserve take that as a part of their civilian jobs are increasingly more in law enforcement and government and not as integrated into the communities as they were in the 60s and the 1970s and even to some degree in the 80s. I'm wondering if your research sort of confirms or denies that. What effect does that have on civil and military relations, willingness to use the Guard and Reserve in these kind of operational roles, willingness to use force more generally, et cetera?
All right, thank you very much. Yes, this was actually a puzzle that we were thinking about a few years ago, and this came up yesterday in some of the conversations around a draft, but this idea from the Vietnam era of, well, the draft is okay, but calling up the reserves would just be massively politically costly and destabilizing, so that we won't do that. Whereas now, the idea is, well, if we went to a draft, that would be massively politically costly and limit our ability to conduct operations because people wouldn't want to do it. But having the Guard and the Reserve deployed all the time is totally fine. So we have done, Lindsay and I, along with Doug Kreiner, have done some survey research where we tried to figure this out. We did a survey experiment where we asked people about hypothetical conflict, one that was designed to be highly supported.
Highly legitimate.
Yes, another country is threatening a US ally. The ally asked us to send troops. I think it was an ally, right?
It was
or a partner.
A friend, a partner.
It is being threatened by another country, asked the US for help. Should the president send troops to help this country defend itself from an aggressor? And then we had different conditions where we would tell them this would involve only the active duty force, this would involve mobilizing the reserve component, this would involve conscription, or conscription and mobilizing the reserve component, to see if there was different support among those scenarios. And what we found, which given today's context was not particularly surprising, was that telling people that there would be conscription did decrease support for the operation, although not by all that much. It was still a majority who supported it. But telling them that the Guard and Reserve would be mobilized made no difference. And in particular, we asked people to estimate the conflict in terms of how many US casualties they thought there would be, whether it would affect them personally or someone that they loved. And people did not view reserve mobilization as more costly in any of these dimensions than just the use of the active duty force, while they did they did see conscription as potentially costly in particular ways. And even more than that, once you controlled for those costs, there was still a direct effect from conscription of something about it that people it made them less supportive of the conflict, even controlling for some of the kind of practical effects that it might have, which fits with a lot of what we know about American political culture, some of the things Ron was talking about yesterday with liberty and individualism.
And consent.
Consent, right, is potentially not that surprising. All of which is to say that it does seem like today reserve mobilization is not perceived as costly in that way and sort of having those effects of reaching into communities. We've actually been trying to get data on this, so if anybody has it, please let us know, about this idea of a shift in what members of the Guard and Reserve do in their day jobs. But there is at least some evidence that we're moving towards having more people who are effectively full-time members of the reserve component or in other jobs that are just much more adjacent and much less disrupted, whether it's federal employment or other things, than in the 90s when there were concerns of if the reserves are mobilized, we're not going to have any airline pilots and things like that.
Yeah, this qualitative shift that you mentioned around reserve component personnel is something that reserves are certainly aware of. Two data points that I'm familiar with are one, what you say about the shift into public sector employment, the shift away from sort of small business or professional as reserve leaders is very real, and it's something that has been documented. The second is the relatively high level of USERRA enforcement activity over the last 20 years. USERRA is the statute that protects reservists when they're called up, and yet despite the general support for veterans and military personnel in society, there seem to be thousands of cases a year of USERRA discrimination that are still brought to the Department of Labor and Department of Justice. And there seems to be some disconnect there. And that then has a legacy too. People self-select out of service because they see that you can't actually get a fair shake from your civilian employer if you're gone 1 out of 5 years. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out. And I think we have time for one more question before we hit time. So, sir.
I'm Jason Smith from the other NWC, the National War College, not to be confused with y'all's. Two significant events I see the past 20 years that you didn't mention that I think have kind of also blurred the lines or changed the relationship between the federal and the state when it comes to National Guard. And I'd like your comments on it. One, the elevation of the Guard to a full member of the Joint Chiefs. And then post-Katrina or during Katrina, the blame on the president and the federal government for what was seen as a failure to respond and the political backlash from that. Every event since then, there's been a way leaning forward of the federal government because no president's going to be caught the way President Bush was during Katrina. So your comments on if that's affected at all. Thank you.
Well, it's my understanding in reading it that the governor did not request support from the president. Now, the same thing happened in the Florida Guard. The governor didn't request support, but President Bush 1 just sent the military in anyway. So it's always that fine balance of am I asked or am I being told? So I think that was a challenge that each state has to have. And I think in the aftermath of Katrina, I don't believe any governor would not request federal support from the president, along with recommendations by FEMA. And then regarding having the National Guard be elevated, the chief being elevated to a 4-star, it's still kind of new. I think we're on our 3rd 4-star chief. It's not going to replace the day-to-day operational command and control of the 54 the 53. The district works for the Secretary of Defense, and that can be problematic because if you have 4 stars, you've got to command something. Again, and I'm speaking as a private retired citizen, and I got one more birthday before I'm not eligible for recall. So I'm not sure, how that has helped having a 4-star. The reserves, the Army Reserve and the Air Force Reserve are still at a 3-star level. I mean, I remember when the chief of the National Guard Bureau was, the directors were 2 stars. So I'm just not sure. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Jess, Lindsay, before we wrap up?
So I would just quickly say, to the point about the elevation of the head of the National Guard, I mean, to me, that's the kind of thing that organizationally is potentially significant and sending signals about how the military views the total force and the integration of the total force. We're also seeing this in some, I believe it was sort of Army recruiting, that there was going to be more of a push to move towards kind of a total recruiting package of all of the components of the Army, branding things being similar, which I think tells us organizationally that they're kind of leaning into this idea of the total force working the way that it does and being an operational reserve. I don't think it's something that the public is particularly likely to know about. Some of our other work, as part of a survey, we asked people, we did some sort of knowledge checks on what people know about the Guard and Reserve, and it was not, perhaps not surprisingly, not a lot. I mean, it was, I'm trying to remember that we had a question about sort of defining what the National Guard was that people did sort of okay with, but not great.
Then there was the other one where they were pretty sure that the National Guard and the Coast Guard were the same thing.
Well, so this one of the options for defining it was actually the definition of the Coast Guard, and some people chose that one. But knowing, over historically, when have the Guard and Reserve been mobilized, things like that, people didn't have a lot of familiarity with. So it's one of those where I think it still matters as sort of organizational policy and things that change, but is not something necessarily that the public are particularly attuned to, nor would I really expect them to be.
Dr. Cohn, last word.
Oh, I have nothing intelligent to add.
Speechless. Yes. Thank you very much for this incredibly thoughtful discussion. Thank you for joining us as well. There is coffee in the lobby. We'll be back here at, I think, 10:45 for the next panel of distinguished colleagues, and look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.
That was great. Thank you.
That was amazing.